Over the last few months, we've been talking to one of the greatest folklorists in the South, William Bill Ferris, about four films that he released simultaneously in 1975 based on field recordings and film that he had created and captured in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And today we are talking about one of those films called Made in Mississippi. Bill, welcome back. So glad you're here.
It's an honor to be on your show, Chuck.
Thank you very much. So, when you conceived those four films together, how did you understand the role of Made in Mississippi within that mix? What did material culture tell us that music or storytelling or religion couldn't?
When I began my work as a folklorist, the inspiration from childhood on was music. The hymns in Rose Hill Church, the blues and rock and roll I grew up with. That was what I thought was the elephant in the room that I needed to try to understand. And I did photograph and interview quilt makers and sculptors. They, in many ways, were the richest and most important voices that I was interviewing. The kind of knowledge that was passed down in what one quilt maker, Picolia Warner, called fireplace learning was a powerful way of sharing and preserving knowledge that goes back in every generation to Africa and for thousands of years. Our first knowledge was oral, and in the Black community, it has a deep and sacred kind of value.
Right. I got the sense you must have had to travel quite a bit. You were in towns, up in the hill country in North Mississippi, you were in the Delta, you were down in southern Mississippi. Did the film sort of come together in your mind after those travels or as you were doing them, or did you have all that in mind before?
No, I had nothing in mind other than I was following my heart. And usually I would ask, is there a blues singer around? And they would point me to Black Dog in Leland, where James Thomas lived. But along the way in Leland, I met Esther Chris, who had this beautiful garden with blooming flowers growing out of flower pots that she had made from old discarded tires that she filled with rich dirt and planted, and her garden was a show place. And I obviously could not pass that up. And so we filmed her and talked with her about her beautiful garden and how she created the pots out of old tires. And so it became increasingly clear that I was working in an incredibly rich world in which there was music, there were stories, and there was art.
I found it striking that the film starts with Richard Foster talking about, first his grandfather and then on down through his generation in their family didn't talk, he wasn't talking about, making certain objects that might get stuck in a museum. He was talking about how they built places to live for themselves, right? And he talked about, you know, we are poor people in the same boat together, and how the skills it took to create these homes that they lived in, how it all got passed within the community through neighbors and kinfolks.
There is a sense of community and shared knowledge and shared responsibility. If you make a quilt, you will often give it to a neighbor who needs a quilt. I was really interested that the whole concept of art really didn't exist. Everything is seen as very practical. To me, film is essential because all too often, when we see a quilt in a museum or a work of folk art, it's labeled as anonymous. The creator is not remembered. But in the film, we cannot forget the voices of people who made the quilt or sculpted the skull or face or built the house.
Right. That brings me to another thing that I was curious to get your thoughts about, which is the social aspect of the making. There's this scene in Made in Mississippi where we see the women quilting by lamplight, and it's so intimate. And I wonder how important was the social dimension of the making to the objects themselves? In other words, did community shape the finish or form of the thing as much as the individual makers did?
I give the maker a lot of credit because they're like the master storyteller or uh, the consummate gospel singer who leads the choir. They are recognized in the community as the most gifted at what they do. And so when others gather around to either watch or join in, as in a quilting bee, uh, you have a dominant figure whose voice or whose hand is clearly the most skilled in the room. And everyone knows it and respects that person for what they bring to the gift of making the object.
You know, the people who typically make art objects that wind up in galleries or museums, there's an element of commerce in that, of course, right? And I'm sort of curious about how did these artists that you filmed 50 years ago in Mississippi, how did they think about authorship and ownership and the audiences that would see their work?
Well, I think they thought of their work as embedded in the community, either the neighborhood or the rural roads where they lived. They had neighbors whose families had known each other for generations, and those quilts were part of that tradition. And the idea of selling an object was really not existent. And if you offered money, they often thought, "Are you crazy? It's not worth, whatever it is you wanted to give." There was a sense of money not existing within the context of what they did. James Thomas gave his skulls and faces away. If you would
Mm,
like one, he would make it for you and you put it on your mantle or your table. If
yeah,
someone needed a quilt, the quilt maker would make it, and if you paid for the fabric in it, that was a sort of trade. But the concept of a museum is something that traditionally did not exist. It does today, and thankfully, people in places like Gee's Bend see their quilts in the Metropolitan Museum in New York and all over the world, and they bring handsome prices, which they deserve. It's also interesting to look at the quilt and how it inspired Southern artists who were major artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. Their abstract art, they acknowledged, began with the quilts that they were drawn to as children growing up in Texas and in South Carolina.
Do you feel like making this film taught you something about the boundary between folk art and fine art?
What I've always tried to do is build the bridges across troubled waters. And what we call folk or vernacular art and fine art should not be a division. Art is art. And whether it's Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns or James Thomas and Amanda Gordon, they're all creative people who have a genius at what they do. And they have a process that involves imagination and dreams. The total being is at work in creating that.
I want to talk about Arthur Turner in this film. You know, him making and then playing the cane
Yes.
fife quite literally ties the making of an object to the music, you know. And it's a thing that he makes with an available material, you know, stalks of river cane and a pocket knife, and out of that comes all sorts of things, recreation and music and dance and culture. I think there's really tremendous significance in that.
It's like a holistic moment when he makes that cane. He's on his horse with several of the stalks of cane on his shoulder, riding out. Then he cuts it and tests it and forms a fife. That is art in itself. And then he goes to the 4th of July picnic and plays it all day as people gather and have barbecue and dance. It is an extraordinary kind of convergence of art and music and celebration.
Real joy comes out of that.
Yes.
Real joy. And it's interesting to me, you know, because 7 years after this film was released in 1982, suddenly there was Otha Turner and Jessie Mae Hemphill performing on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you
Yes.
know. And then later in his career, you know, he was recording albums, and Martin Scorsese included him in his 2003 documentary about the blues. So I'm really curious, Bill, how did you find out in 1975 about Otha Turner?
Well, it was actually 1970 that my friend David Evans, who had worked in that community for many years, suggested that we do a film together. And so I took my little camera up, and he had his tape recorder, and we shot that footage. And it was done with a wing and a prayer. We had no money, just a few rolls of film and tape. And it's been shown all over the world as a tribute to Otha Turner and both the making of the fife and the playing it at the picnic. It's a beautiful film. And now his granddaughter, Sade Thomas,
Right.
plays that instrument, and she really could go on the stage in Carnegie Hall. She's an extraordinarily gifted artist and singer, and she was part of our Voices of Mississippi show that was inspired by the box set with her her
Right.
grandfather's music in it, and here is the granddaughter keeping that tradition alive and well.
Well, I've seen her play, and she is amazing. When you were making the films originally, when you were traveling all over Mississippi and talking to these people, what did they ask of you in return? I mean, did anyone articulate their hopes for how their work would be seen in the
But
future?
they sometimes said, now, if we tell you about all of this, do you promise to put it out there so they'll know what it was like down here?
Mm.
And both the beauty and the horrific stories were shared with me. And I told them that I would include them in my book, on my film, on my recordings, which I've done. And the response has been powerful. My books have all remained in print. The recordings won 2 Grammys. The films have not stopped being seen and circulated. So that to me says that what I did had an enduring value, not only in this country, but all over the world. People who don't even speak English understand the music, and they look at these crafts films, and in their culture, whether it's in China or Africa or wherever, uh, they understand exactly the power of the communities where traditions are being preserved in the way that they are in the film. There was a tremendous pride. Wherever I went, I photographed. And when I would go home after each trip, I would go into a little dark room that my brother and I set up on the farm, and I would process the film. It was black and white, Tri-X and Plus X. And then I would print 8 by 10 photographs of the people I'd been with. And when I went back, I gave them a set of those photographs. And if I went back again, those photographs would be framed on the wall.
Hmm.
There were never enough photographs. They wanted more. And then when the book came out, the first book was Blues from the Delta. I sent copies to everyone that I had worked with, and they wrote back after a while and they said, "Send more copies. We loaned ours out," and they never brought it back. Well, to me,
Yeah.
that was a high compliment. And then later, many of these musicians were featured at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival on the Mall in the 70s when they featured Mississippi as a state. And they came back as national heroes. They spent a week performing on the mall with capacity crowds that fill that mall every day to meet them, to see them, and to hear the music and watch the stories and the crafts being created. So it was a recognition that they had never dreamed of, that their traditions brought to their doorstep.
When we talk about the practices that you showcase in this film, and they are many and varied, uh, which of those practices have you gotten to watch over the years evolve or endure? And if a young documentarian came to you today and said, I would like to see how the objects and art forms that you documented 50 years ago are enduring today, what would you say to them?
I would say go back to those communities and knock on doors, and you will find quilt makers, blues singers, gospel singers, carpenters who are building homes, just as Richard Foster's father, Frank Foster, built that dog trot. You will find traditions. They may be different. They will be different. Instead of the traditional blues, it might be hip hop
Mm-hmm.
or rap, but they can also play the blues. Those musics are still alive and well in all generations, and they will always be there. They will change, but the foundational sounds and the crafts and skills will always be there.
What do you feel like the artists in Made in Mississippi taught you, and how did that change your later projects and your teaching later in your career?
They taught me a humility to never think you have all the answers. I was a teenager, and then a young kid who thought, well, if I do something with the blues, I've really hit, you know, the mother lode. But it's the things you don't notice that are most important. The quiet artist working away in the shadows of a home rather than on a stage. And it's there you find the richest and deepest vein of the creativity that this culture represents. And so you learn to listen, you learn to pay attention to all of the worlds that you explore as a folklorist with your camera and motion picture film, and that you try to capture everything. You cast a wide net, and it's the thing that you consider least important that down the road may be most important. So try to respect everyone who is there that's doing work that's creative, and you won't regret it.
So many of us, when we're young and eager, will sit in a conversation with someone, and rather than truly listening to that person, uh, we're sitting there trying to figure out what we will say when the other person stops talking. And it's there is a sense, even though you were much younger when these films were being shot, that you were learning that lesson about how to listen.
I think listening, when I teach how you do an interview in my classes, listening is a skill. And when you're interviewing someone and there's a long pause in conversation, you feel like, well, you should say something to keep the conversation going, but you should not. You let that pause hang there, and then they'll come back with the most amazing thoughts that follow because they're going deeper into their memory to bring out some real jewels compared with what they've just said. But if you break in and try to keep it going, then you preempt them from doing that. So, when you're listening, you're speaking in a way with your silence, and you give them the confidence to go deeper into what it is they want to tell you. And that gives the most powerful kind of interview that you could have.
When you think back on the making of this film, is there a particular moment that most often comes to your mind? And if so, what was it and why?
I think the moment that really haunts me in a positive way is when James Thomas has made this skull out of clay, and we see his children all around him watching him. And then he picks it up and he holds it next to his face. And I filmed and then I photographed it. And it's a powerful moment in which he, like the people he suggested pay attention, is meditating, I think, about this is where I and all of us are headed. And that's what
Yeah.
that photograph does to me, is to remind me of the moment with him when he has finished this work of art, and it all of a sudden becomes an animated person in the sense that it has a voice of its own, uh, along with the voice of James Thomas, that is really timeless.
In our first two episodes, you talked about how documenting Black life in the South, in the rural South, was a political act. One phrase you used to describe it was etching a mark on the face of oblivion. And I'm wondering how that connection shapes your choices about who speaks in a film and where you place the camera and how long you let a scene breathe.
I really follow my heart, and if it's music that is heartfelt, that I connect with, uh, I run until the tape and film runs out. And those voices explaining in such powerful ways what they do are the great teachers. And for me, every one of these voices and the recordings made of them and film are political acts because they are not welcome on primetime television. We
Mm-hmm.
don't hear them in the news, but they are the voice that anchors us as Americans. And increasingly, both black and white American artists, visual and musical and literary, turn south to these voices as their inspiration.
I
And if they can't find them, that's a major loss for our nation. And to the degree that these films are seen and preserved, that is a political act to say this is something that is a national treasure in this little community.
Well, Bill, I want to thank you again. I'm so grateful that I get to sit here and let you share your wisdom with me and by extension with the readers and viewers of Salvation South. It just means the world to me, and I thank you for your time.
I feel the same way about you, Chuck.
Thanks so much, and we will talk soon about I Ain't Lying, the
I
fourth in
look
the
forward
series of
to it.
films. Yeah, me
Thank
too.
you.
You're welcome.